H-1B FY 2027. Warning: why USCIS is returning CAP registrations today. The email arrived at 11:47 on a weekday morning. Not a letter, not a phone call. An email, one paragraph, automated language, cold and bureaucratic the way only a government system can be cold. It said the registration had been invalidated. The software engineer who received that email had been through this process before. He knew the timeline. He knew the lottery odds. He knew what it meant to finally see a selection notice after 3 consecutive years of not being selected. He had been selected this year. And now, without warning, without explanation beyond a single form phrase, the registration that carried his name and his work authorization future had been returned. Not denied at the petition stage, not rejected after review. Returned before the petition was ever filed. A sudden silence where there should have been momentum. A bright line crossed in a direction nobody expected. An automated system making a decision that felt anything but automatic to the family on the other side of it. This didn't unfold over months. It unfolded in hours. Hours that could end an employer's hiring plan. Hours that could collapse a worker's transition timeline. Hours that could force a family to start calculating whether they are still building a future in this country or beginning to prepare for a departure they never chose. One wrong registration record here, and the entire FY 2027 H-1B CAP cycle could be lost before a single petition ever gets filed. What USCIS discovered in the FY 2027 registration data crossed a line that the integrity of the H-1B CAP system could not absorb. And when that line was identified, the agency did not hesitate. They responded with speed, with documented authority, and with consequences that are landing in inboxes right now. Most registrants, and most employers, panic at this moment. They make the same mistake. They assume the invalidation is final. They assume there is nothing to do. They fall straight into the trap of inaction. But today, you are going to do something different. For several registration cycles now, there had been signals, not from official DHS press releases, not from Federal Register notices, just signals that the H-1B electronic registration system was being used in ways that USCIS had not originally anticipated and could not fully police at the front end. USCIS has been systematic in its approach to H-1B fraud detection, yes, but also selective in when it chooses to act most visibly. The agency has the authority to audit registrations, invalidate those it determines were submitted in bad faith, and remove selected registrations from the pool even after the lottery has run. The pattern that practitioners began noticing followed a rhythm, an escalation, almost a building pressure. Each registration cycle brought more registrations than the last. The FY 2024 cycle set a record. FY 2025 exceeded it. By FY 2026, the volume of registrations had grown so far beyond the available cap numbers that USCIS began conducting multiple lottery rounds, which had been unheard of in the system's original design. But what triggered deeper concern in the immigration enforcement community in the current cycle was that USCIS had been unusually quiet about its fraud detection activity during the registration window itself. No announcements, no public statements, no warnings during the registration period that would have alerted bad actors to change course. Immigration attorneys who monitor H-1B registration trends recognize the indicators. The first is when USCIS publishes total registration numbers without publishing the breakdown of how many registrations came from single beneficiary employers versus staffing companies versus large corporate sponsors. The second is when practitioner accounts start reporting selected registrations being held in a pending or review status longer than normal before petition filing notices are issued. The third is when USCIS quietly updates its internal guidance on what constitutes a bona fide registration without making a public announcement. The sudden silence before the current round of invalidations was the fourth indicator. and it was the loudest one. When USCIS goes quiet on fraud enforcement, something is being built, and when it finally moves, it moves across the entire dataset at once. Early in the FY 2027 post-selection period, USCIS confirmed what practitioners had begun to suspect: a coordinated registration integrity review that identified what the agency described as patterns of fraud and abuse, including multiple registrations submitted for the same beneficiary by entities that appeared to lack genuine employment relationships, at a scale not clearly documented in prior public enforcement actions. These are registrations that exist for one purpose only: to game the lottery, to multiply the statistical chances of a single beneficiary being selected by flooding the registration pool with entries from multiple companies. Companies that in some cases have no real job, no real office, no real employer-employee relationship waiting at the other end of the selection. This type of abuse has three downstream effects when it succeeds. It inflates the total registration count, which reduces the selection probability for every legitimate registrant in the pool. It consumes cap numbers that were intended for workers in genuine employment relationships. And it erodes the integrity of a system that hundreds of thousands of legitimate employers and workers depend on for workforce planning and immigration continuity. Observers watching the FY 2027 data were not certain how aggressively USCIS would act, or whether the invalidation wave would be broad enough to affect registrations that were adjacent to fraud patterns without being directly involved. But one thing was clear: USCIS was changing its enforcement posture on registration integrity, and when that happens without advance public notice, everyone in the selected pool pays attention. The invalidation notices being issued by USCIS today are not routine system errors. They are not glitches. They are not administrative mistakes that can be corrected with a phone call. They are deliberate outputs of a data-driven review process that USCIS has been building since the first wave of mass registration fraud was documented in the FY 2024 cycle. Attorney after attorney reviewing the notices described the enforcement action as targeted, consequential, and most importantly, irreversible within the current cycle, meaning that a registration invalidated for fraud-related reasons cannot be refiled for FY 2027. The cap year is closed. The selection window is gone. The only path forward is FY 2028, which means waiting another full year. For a worker on a non-immigrant visa with an expiring status, that year is not abstract. It is the difference between maintaining work authorization and losing it. For an employer who planned a hiring timeline around an H-1B start date of October 1st, the loss of a selected registration is a workforce gap that may not have an easy domestic solution. The legitimate registrants who are caught in this wave, workers who had nothing to do with the fraud, whose employers submitted their registrations in good faith, but whose registration data happens to resemble the patterns USCIS flagged, are the most vulnerable population in this moment, and their options are narrow. Today, USCIS confirmed that the registration review process targeted employer accounts with high submission volumes, including specific registrant profiles that had recently changed employer-sponsor information in ways that analysts believe were designed to circumvent single beneficiary submission limits. The agency acted before the standard petition filing window could absorb and obscure the fraudulent entries. They targeted employers with disproportionate registration to employee ratios. They targeted registration clusters where multiple employers submitted for the same beneficiary within the same cycle. They targeted accounts connected to IP addresses and payment methods associated with prior enforcement actions. This was not symbolic enforcement. It was data-driven, algorithmic, built on pattern recognition across millions of records. And that is what made it so difficult for legitimate registrants caught in the data patterns to anticipate. The immediate question for any selected registrant who receives an invalidation notice is whether the invalidation is correctly applied or whether it resulted from a false positive in USCIS's pattern detection system. This is not a hypothetical concern. Data-driven enforcement at this scale produces false positives. It is statistically unavoidable. A small business with a single H-1B worker that used a third-party immigration service provider to submit its registration may share characteristics with a fraudulent registration network, not because the business did anything wrong, but because the service provider's submission patterns triggered a flag. A worker who was legitimately registered by two employers in the same cycle, which is permitted under USCIS rules, may appear in the pattern data as a multi-registration abuse case if the system's threshold for what constitutes suspicious duplication is set too aggressively. These are not theoretical edge cases. They are the types of situations that immigration attorneys are already beginning to encounter as the invalidation notices circulate. The response available to a registrant who believes their invalidation was incorrectly applied is not a formal appeal. The H-1B registration system does not have an appeal mechanism in the traditional sense. What exists is the ability to contact USCIS through official channels, present documentation of the legitimacy of the employment relationship, and request reconsideration. That process is not fast, it is not guaranteed, and it does not stop the cap year clock. Understanding the correct response in the first days after receiving an invalidation notice is the most important thing an affected registrant can do right now. The first step is to preserve all documentation related to the employer-employee relationship that was the basis of the registration. Employment agreements, offer letters, job descriptions, evidence that the position is real, the employer is real, and the relationship is genuine. The second step is to contact an experienced H-1B attorney immediately. Not next week, not after you research your options, but immediately. The window for any meaningful intervention in the current cycle is narrow. Every day without professional guidance is a day that window gets smaller. The third step is to understand your current non-immigrant status and what happens to it if the H-1B path for FY 2027 is now closed. If you are on an F1 with OPT or STEM OPT, your authorized stay has a specific end date. If your H-1B selection was part of your plan to maintain continuous work authorization, the invalidation creates a gap that needs a separate solution. There are pathways that exist outside the H-1B cap for some workers in this situation. The O-1A visa for individuals with extraordinary ability, the L-1 visa for intracompany transferees, the TN visa for Canadian and Mexican nationals in qualifying professional categories, the E-3 visa for Australian nationals. These are not available to everyone, but for workers who qualify, they represent alternatives that do not depend on the annual lottery. The O-1A pathway in particular has seen increased attention from workers displaced by H-1B lottery outcomes over the past several years. The standard is demanding. It requires documented evidence of extraordinary achievement in the field. But for workers with published research, industry awards, high compensation relative to peers, or documented critical roles in major projects, the O-1A can be a viable and in some respects more stable alternative to the H-1B. The employer's role in this moment is equally important and equally time-sensitive. Employers who receive invalidation, notices for workers they intended to sponsor, have an obligation to that worker that goes beyond the H-1B petition. If the employer-employee relationship is genuine and the registration was submitted in good faith, the employer should be prepared to document that clearly and to support any reconsideration effort the worker pursues. Employers who use third-party services to submit their registrations need to audit those submissions now. If the service that handled your registration has a history of submitting large volumes of registrations across many employers, your account may have been flagged not because of anything you did, but because of the network you were connected to. This is one of the least discussed risks of outsourcing H-1B registration to immigration service companies that are not licensed attorneys and that operate at high volume. Their submission patterns become your exposure. There is a longer-term dimension to what USCIS is doing with these invalidations that the broader H-1B community needs to understand. The agency is building a record. The invalidation notices going out today are not just enforcement actions for FY 2027. They are data points that will inform how USCIS reviews petitions in future cycles. An employer whose registration was invalidated for fraud-related reasons in FY 2027 will not approach the FY 2028 registration window with a clean slate. Their account will carry a marker. For legitimate employers who believe they were incorrectly flagged, clearing that marker is not just about this cycle. It is about protecting their ability to participate in future cycles without heightened scrutiny. That is a long-term employer interest that demands immediate short-term action. As the FY 2027 cap cycle continues to unfold, more details will emerge about the full scope of what USCIS discovered in the registration data and what it intends to do about the employers and service providers at the center of the fraud patterns. But one thing is already clear. Understanding your rights in this system does not make you a criminal. It makes you smart. It means you are prepared. It means you are protecting your job, your status, and your family's future in this country with the information that actually matters right now. Share this video with every H-1B registrant you know. Share it with the employer who sponsored your registration. Share it with anyone waiting on a selection notice or worried about what an invalidation notice means for their October start date. It might save their case. Subscribe to Visa Status Radar for more protection. We protect you with real information as the next phase of this enforcement cycle unfolds.